In this episode,
we have to understand that Christian faith does not promise us omniscience.
Welcome, friends. My name is Rohadi, and I am recording on Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. This is the Faith in a Fresh Bite podcast, a serial season entitled Farewell Evangelicalism. Where are we going in this episode? In order to say farewell to evangelicalism, we have to make sense of how evangelicals wound up in the place that they're in now. Remember in episode 1, we discussed how we're in this moment in 2025 because of the white evangelical vote remained completely unchanged for the Republican nominee. So let's state the obvious here. There's an enormous chasm that separates evangelicals and the actual teachings of Jesus. And what are the actual teachings of Jesus? I would say read the Gospels, and in particular, Matthew 5. That's a good foundation. But evangelicals no longer adhere to those teachings, at least in public. How are these choices, and many of them bringing active harm on marginalized people groups, justified? It's really simple. You move the goalposts on what does it mean to be a Christian. So how do you convince entire movements, regardless of their specific church tradition or denomination, to adopt the new field of what matters? Well, you utter those veiled threats that Dr. Graves shared with us in episode 2. The real feeling that white evangelicals have about losing their inherited social privileges they've benefited from since colonization. Say that the white way of life is under threat, and you can motivate a lot of white people. In this episode, we talk about the susceptibility in evangelicalism to conspiracy theory, tracing back the relationship between conservative Christians, white culture preservation, and the type of church culture required to support the entire malformed machine. We then pivot to describe how it's possible to reject fundamental teachings of Jesus in favor of partisan politics that lately only exist to enrich the ultra-wealthy class at the expense of literally everybody else. It becomes crucial for us to name how it's possible to sway so many evangelicals. Because we can't just blame every individual evangelical or conservative Christian. We're actually naming in this episode and this entire series about how rugged individualism is one of the failures of Western culture. So we can't just blame the individual. Rather, we need to pinpoint the gatekeepers in the industry of conservative religion. And that's the leaders, the pastors. For that, I've invited my friend Dr. Ed Ng to discuss the psychology behind malformed components in evangelicalism that in fact produces a type of leader. The cultural conditions in evangelicalism are indeed designed to attract the most toxic, narcissistic suckers to lead wonderless churches of folks already afraid of losing their white or white Christian way of life, who are also easily manipulated to claw even deeper towards militancy and self-preservation regardless of the damage incurred and produced. Add in the dash of conspiracy theory and propaganda to keep the machine rolling, and you have a recipe for the disaster that we're in now. So let's get started. My first guest will be Jared Stacy, who is a theologian and ethicist, former pastor as well. He has a PhD in moral and practical theology from the University of Aberdeen, but his research focuses on the intersection of theology and politics. You might have heard from him on Time or NPR or BBC. He has spoken specifically on ethics, extremism, and conspiracy theory vis-a-vis U.S. evangelicalism. Jared Stacy on deck, with a little interlude from Daniel Wheat.
The apocalypse came like a thief in the night. It shifted our vision and challenged our sight. Still trying to figure when But it seems most of us chose hell for our part.
Welcome, Jared. First off, can you name the lands on which your feet touch?
Yeah, Powhatan land is Fredericksburg, Virginia, just south of D.C.
I asked Jared to ease us into a conversation on conspiracy theory, and it starts with a history lesson.
Way back in ancient Rome.
Back 2,000 years.
So
Yeah.
no, I like how I will start with Rome. And I'll start with actually one of my favorite conspiracy theories to talk about, because it has to do with a Roman emperor by the name of Nero. And
Heard of him?
Yeah, Nero committed suicide. And there was a legend that grew among the Roman elites and also the Roman poor, which is a really interesting combination. There were those who loved and benefited from Nero, and there were those who hated him. And there were some elites who mourned that he was gone, and the spectacles that he provided for the poor too was something that was missing and lost. So this legend developed, right? When it's ancient, we call it a legend. When it's modern, we call it a conspiracy theory, that Nero was going to come back. That Nero wasn't dead, that he was going to come back, and that he was going to bring armies with him from the east, and he was going to march on Rome and restore Rome to its glory. That happened around AD 68. And in the book of Revelation, which today gets kind of trotted out for evangelicals to sort of code and or decode everything going on, there's a reference to Nero. And this idea that this beast is going to have this wound, and it will be a mortal wound, but the beast will survive and people will marvel at the beast, right? This is all symbolic language, but it was really recognizable to the early Christians at that time that, oh, hey, like this is a reference to the power of empire and the propaganda empire puts out. 300 years later, Rome is falling. Barbarians are invading, and people are blaming Christians. Over 300 years later, Christians are now the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. And this bishop from Hippo named Augustine writes this defense and says, it's not the Christian's fault. That's his main, it's reducing a brilliant work down to, hey, it's not our fault. That's a massive oversimplification. But
hey, sound bites, right?
Yeah. My point is the legend of Nero's return was popular with Christians too. And it was so popular that Augustine mentions it as sort of, hey, this is what people believe the Antichrist was, that Nero was going to return, that the Antichrist was going to rise, and that there would be this big battle, and that Christ would come back. I mentioned that one because it's so foreign to us here and now, because it's dealing with Rome in 368, but it's oddly familiar. It's oddly familiar. And the reason I share it is because I want to invite people to really consider two things. The first is that part of the reason that people believe conspiracy theories is just because we're limited creatures, that we're always trying to narrate beyond our capacity to know and to see. We're always trying to fill in the gaps. And there's something very human about that desire. And then the second reason I bring it up is because of the way that Christianity presents itself as a claim about what we can't see. And what ends up happening, and there's so many other variables to discuss here about modern people. But when it comes to the way that conspiracy theory gets entangled in Christianity, it doesn't have to be this way. That's what I want to tell people. It doesn't have to be this way. But in order to untangle this, in order to disconnect the suspicion that leads to conspiratorial narrations from Christian faith, we have to understand that Christian faith does not promise us omniscience. That Christian faith, held among creatures like us, it provokes uncertainty and mystery before it ever gives us the keys and the sight to see what's going on behind closed doors. Because what so easily happens is that people say, I believe that Jesus is alive and not dead. And there's an uncritical link between that claim, that central claim of Christianity. It's a really uncritical line that we kind of plug in to this. When you treat the resurrection as sort of the prime alternative fact, there's a really uncritical way in which it shares its power with a really corrosive form of suspicion, is to the way that Christian faith wrongly, falsely lends its authority to claims of suspicion and stories of suspicion that Christians in the here and now try to tell about the world around them.
Yeah.
And that's the theological crisis at stake. So my question for those who are listening, if you try to dispute a conspiracy theory held by a Christian, it's very hard to get them to disbelieve it because they held it not just as a human being, but as a Christian. That you are not only instigating a crisis of fact, but you're also instigating a crisis of faith. Because if they have to rethink this fact, it's also implicating their faith. And that's what no meta fact checker can ever get at. That's where the church's responsibility comes in.
It's the church's job to counter conspiratorial narrative, because you're going to have propaganda and conspiracy all over the place. Doesn't matter the age, doesn't matter the time, it's going to happen. What helps is a participating church that counters the narrative with the teachings of Jesus. But here's the problem. What happens when the church and the denomination are part of the ruse? Here's Jared again as we take the examples from ancient Rome as foundation and we propel them into the present.
There's not a single period. So roughly we're talking about 300 years from the time that, the evangelical movement began, and that's arbitrary, but the guild of historians has to do something. They have to put a finger on a map and a timeline and say, this is when it started. So, but
tell me why I should care.
We're looking at 300 years, and over these 300 years in America, there's never a time where you won't find evangelicals making use of conspiratorial narrations in their articulation of the gospel. So let me. I'm going to skip a stone. I'm going to skip a stone across, and we'll just get ahead. Before the American Revolution, there were and after, there were always anxieties over slave revolts. And that was one of the earliest conspiratorial anxieties that shaped American society. And evangelical preachers like George Whitefield, who's probably one of the most well-known, Benjamin Franklin went to hear him. He was a celebrity. He preached a gospel that made slave owners angry, because he actually did preach it to enslaved people, but he preached it in a way that was domesticating the enslaved and saying you need to be a good slave. He was a maverick, but he didn't go far enough. And the whole premise of this was it was a gospel that promised to pacify the white anxiety for slave revolts. And that conspiracy theory in many cases is a true one, because there were slave revolts. It did happen. But the white anxiety over the possibility of slave revolts was a very real threat, and one that was built into the social order. And so you're going to hear me saying that social order all the way through, because what ends up happening is oftentimes the gospel as evangelicals preach assumes Christendom. It assumes it assumes an empire, a social order that's supposed to be static, just like the immutable God that they're called. Right. So I'm not getting into I want to hit pause. I don't want to suggest that God changes endlessly, but he's immutable. That's part of Christian confession. But our experience, our way of narrating, our encounter with this God, the easiest way I could say it is the difference between Moses going up to Sinai and seeing the fire and the wind, and Elijah going up that same mountain and only meeting a still small voice. This is a living God. So evangelicals want to rush to dogma and doctrine to kind of trot out God's immutability. But that's the difference between theology and ideology. That we're talking about this static system, a Christian biblical worldview. So that's another element. So, but that worldview always kind of shows itself in this commitment to a static social order. And the earliest one was these slave revolts. When you fast forward past the Civil War into Jim Crow. We don't have the time to go into that, but the conspiracy theories about Jim Crow and what it would mean to give African Americans the vote. When you fast forward to the Great War, World War I, conspiracy theories about immigrants and Jews were a dominant feature of fundamentalist preaching, fundamentalist evangelical preaching at the time.
Okay.
And we would recognize a lot of these today. So Billy Sunday was a very popular revivalist. He preached during the Great War. He said, that if they say that we're the great melting pot, well, it's up to us to cut off the slag that doesn't melt into Americanism and throw it to hell.
Wow. Yeah.
And so and I want to emphasize that even later, when the topic changed from immigrants and Jews to communists, these conspiracy theories did not arise from within evangelicalism. They were absorbed by evangelicalism because they were permeating the white America consciousness. So we have to be clear in saying that evangelicals are largely, you mentioned earlier the sort of cynicism and feeling like the church isn't going to change. And it made me realize that, when it comes to forming Christians, the evangelical church, as I understand it, has been formed by it. We talk about being radical, but we come out being deeply formed to the tenets of free market capitalism and call that Christian freedom.
Yeah.
And so we are fundamentally unable to even have the language to articulate the various isms that provide us with the things that we say are obvious or clear or biblical.
Hang on. You think capitalism is that bedrock foundation to that?
I think it's a key part of it. When you trace the historical legacy of conspiracy theory in America in general, there's always that conservative notion that labor is going to rise up against capital, right? So you're dealing with, in the political sense, a lot of the Cold War conspiracies about communists always were a continuation of the narrative in the 30s that the New Deal and FDR was the advent of the Antichrist and tyranny. And those end up just being a theological dressing for the concern of labor. And so again, there's an economic material component here that I don't want people to miss out on either. So you go all the way through up to the deep state kind of concern in the 80s and 90s. Let me give you another final example before we get to the MAGA world, which I think is really apparent to everyone. But I've said this before in recounting this history, that I think one of the things that shows the way that conspiracy theories as storytelling acts are so popular among evangelicals is also because we don't tell our story accurately either. That some of the root of our desire to spin stories about our political and social moment is also a willingness to forge a sort of forgetfulness over the sort of people that we've been in the past. And that's why I think this history, recounting it this way, has a moral power. It's not to say that evangelicals are the only people with a penchant for conspiracy theory. That's just not the case. Yeah. America is the land of conspiracy, and we're always sort of endlessly suspicious of these things. But when I say there's something that happens when evangelical absorbs this stuff, we become a people who are more interested in what something can do for us and how it can serve this urgency and desire for the gospel that we have. And this hit home for me personally when I was a kid and the school shooting happened at Columbine. Mm-hmm. And when I was in youth group when that happened, and for 3 years, the Columbine martyr narratives were a really core key component of mapping for me what it meant to be Christian, what the sort of, and I quite literally began entertaining well, how do I know if I'm a Christian if I can't answer yes at gunpoint?
Okay. By now, you're getting a sense that conspiracy theories and propaganda have a designer, and that we get to a place of belief for a certain group because someone shaped and formed their thought to believe those things. When we consider contemporary movements, that's how we got here, we can start to pinpoint activities in evangelicalism across different associations, denominations, think tanks, and so forth. When we can name how these organizations have contributed to thought, we can start to ascertain why evangelicals believe the things that they do. I asked Jared if he can name some of the intersections of who is behind designing conspiracy theory in right-wing conservative Christianity.
The first thing is something that's actually nameless, and that's just that we're all breathing the air of modern individualism. And that's nameless, but it shapes how we understand how the way the world works. Every conspiracy theory has this common feature where it narrates the world in terms of personal cause and effect. That Joe Biden stole the 2020 election. Like Joe Biden, it says, sat in his office and told this Democrat operative and that Democrat operative, like, don't count those votes, don't do that. And at base, that is a way of re-narrating the world in terms of how you think it works, which is personal individual actions. And evangelicals, because we often hold this idea that salvation is a personal mechanistic conversion, like pray this prayer, boom, that was always trotted out in the Cold War as a way to stand against communism. Like we need personal revival, personal repentance, and because we're capitalists, we're not communists, we're capitalists. America. So that's a complexity that doesn't always get talked about. But for people like modern people like us who just kind of assume like, oh yeah, the world works because we enact choices that have effects. That's the world is more complex than that. There's a complexity and even a chaos to how the world works that our ways of narrating the world fail to accommodate and reflect. And conspiracy theory in many ways fails because it's a caricature. Like it's almost comical, like that it's just personal actions. The conspiracy theories that have been proven true in some respects, like the Tuskegee experiment, these things are very complex, and they often escape our ability to narrate them. So that's one nameless thing. But what we can do is we can look at material network analysis. Who relates to whom? What are the terms of this relationship? How does this work? And then there's also the theological beliefs that sort of give justification and motivation to that. I think one figure that kind of concentrates in and it does a lot of those things for people is Tim LaHaye. So Tim LaHaye was a co-author of the Left Behind series.
Oh yeah.
And right alongside Columbine, like the Left Behind books for me were a huge form of my own devotion as a kid growing up. Historian Daniel Hummel says that, the Left Behind books in so many ways primed the American population for QAnon, that the notion of hidden chaos and all that kind of, and those books feature a one world totalitarian government, right? Left Behind didn't invent that apocalyptic
but they sold 80 million copies of that. Exactly. And someone got paid.
Exactly. So Tim LaHaye was a theologian, he was a pastor, and he was also an activist. And not only did he co-write these books that were wildly popular and gave many Americans their eschatology, even if they're not a Christian.
He built their fear as well as their eschatology.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But he also was an activist, and he was the first president of something called the Council for National Policy. Now, the Council for National Policy was created in the 80s, and it was basically made to counter similar coalitions on the American left. But when Ann Nelson has a great book that kind of does a lot of the analysis with the CNP. But Tim LaHaye was its first president. Tim LaHaye, in one of his books, defending his theology, opens up and says that he believes that the Illuminati are real and that they've been trying to destroy quote unquote Judeo-Christian society for 200 years. And I talk about that. That's a receipt, right? So here we have someone who's kind of said, I'm an avowed conspiracy theorist. Like this is happening, the threat.
Yeah. But no one batted an eye. Okay.
Yeah, no one batted an eye. Now the CMP is still around. And in 2019, the CMP counted among its ranks the three largest Christian radio networks in America.
Put a pin in this moment because we come back to the question of media and the who is behind the propaganda and the conspiracy theory. It's by design, and if we can name the who, we can pinpoint some of the sources of what has shaped and formed belief systems. Okay, let's jump back in.
One of those was Salem Media Group, and one of the talk show that it hosts is Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA.
Okay.
So Salem hosts Charlie Kirk. When 2020 rolls around, in the years leading up to 2020, a lot of the CMP's private meetings that were actually leaked included a lot of meetings or a lot of talks given about stealing elections, almost priming the pump. When things got really acute in 2020, a lot of what Charlie Kirk put out on the internet, and I've got the tweets, you can go back. They're easily indexable and searchable. You can find a lot of these leaders with ties to the CMP, and it intersects money and denominations and all these sorts of things. So it's a really easy way to kind of articulate, like, here's a bunch of the architects whose sort of theological beliefs converge with ideology, converge with material benefits of money and prestige, those sorts of things, power. And so it all kind of coalesces and concentrates in the CMP. And there's other ways to talk about it for sure, but when you look at the CMP and Tim LaHaye and all of it, it just kind of intersects really nicely to give people an example that these beliefs are not just floating up in the air.
No.
That they are driving real material connection and networking that wields a particular power. The songs they heard on Sunday, now in the afternoon on the way back, you're listening to Charlie Kirk on the same TV show, so on the same radio program or the podcast, right? So the media kind of networks, these have a way of fusing, worship with the conservative word. And when you fuse those two together, it's really difficult to unpack. Well, like good Christians should believe that the Democrats are going to steal the election, right? Pastors can bemoan all day the influence of media, but it's usually always directed at the secular media, at ventures like NPR.
Yeah.
We have no language or capacity to talk about the way that we just assume, that's political. This is biblical, right? And that move has a way of self-justifying the architecture that we've built around us, the networks that we built around us, that in so many ways normalize, give permission, and give potency to propaganda that we really don't even have the language to talk about. And I come back to thinking, like, the church should be the place actually where these slogans and these things are actually emptied of their power. But unfortunately, the exact opposite seems to be happening, especially when it's so easy. I know this personally. It's so easy to be a pastor in evangelicalism and benefit from it and have a really nice religious career.
You play the game, or else the result is that you're going to lose all of your inheritance and that privilege, at least for the leadership, which is why you don't see a lot of shifts because of these folks who have no transferable skills. And what else are you going to do? If you stand for truth, you will be thrown out of your church. Thank you, Jared, for opening the door to the history behind conspiracy theory. We've identified the ways that evangelicals are susceptible to conspiracy theory and the ways that they use conspiracy theory to accommodate and accomplish their goals. It's by design. Remember episode 2, and naming the different intersections and moments in history where evangelicals have been very intentional to guide their congregations to not merely vote in a particular way, but to believe in a particular way of life. This in turn produces certain types of communities. It changes their culture. And to make sense of the cultural realities in evangelicalism, I've invited my friend Dr. Ed Eng to come and share a little bit from the psychology behind why evangelicals believe the things that they do. we'll have a little bit of an intersection interrogating narcissistic leaders who, by and large, you can find them all over evangelicalism. Why is that? Here's Dr. Ng carrying on this conversation in Farewell Evangelicalism.
My name is Ed Ng. I'm a registered psychologist here in British Columbia. Well, I reside and work on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam Nation.
We start our conversation by exploring a social theory that explains a lot of the cultural reasons and rationales of why evangelicals believe the things they believe. The theory is called terror management theory.
Yeah. Well, it was not my theory. It was posited like about 10 years ago in a book form, but it's always kind of been with us in one way or another. What it really kind of says, terror management theory, is that when we're afraid, we tend to reach for black and white or simple or yes or no solutions, something that's more concrete, rather than something that considered maybe in the gray areas or a both and sort of muddle. But when we're afraid, we tend to reach for solid things, concrete things that we can attach ourselves to. So whether that's a leader or whether it's an ideology or something that makes us feel like we belong and that we have some sense of certainty, we reach for those things. And so what creates that idea of black and white in a lot of ways can be the leaders that espouse a certain ideology. And so this is how Mussolini, Hitler, Donald Trump, they come to power in part because they promise a sense of certainty. They promise that they're going to fix things. And that appeals to people who are afraid because they think, good, now we're going to have somebody doing what we exactly want you to do, which is to fix it. And they're able to locate the problem. Problem is this people group, that people group, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I'll fix it. And the communication of that problem is in fact crystal clear. And it's so simple. It is simplistic, in fact.
Absolutely.
Intentionally. Yeah. And that's one of the ways that makes it absorbable. I don't know if that's a word, but
right. Sexy is another word, or just interesting, or just attractive for people who are quite honestly like languishing, looking for a sense of clarity.
Yeah.
So part of terror management theory comes around part because we've been dealing with a lot of fear over, decades now. When you think about it, I'm Gen X, and they say of Gen X, one of the distinctives is that we grew up during the height of the Cold War. I remember when I was 10 years old and I was looking at Maclean's magazine, and there was a big mushroom cloud in the front of it. And, I can remember there are so many movies that came out in the 80s about nuclear war and about the aftermath and about just how awful it's going to be. I wouldn't say it was necessarily traumatizing, but it certainly sensitized a lot of us to this feeling of fragility in our lives. Now, how that affected us, I don't really quite know, because that's something people are still piecing together. But we grew up in this era of fear, especially of communists, especially of Russia, well, Soviet Union at the time. And then, of course, in the modern era or post 2000, after 9/11, and we've had this wholesale vilification of people from what's known as the Middle East, right? Because of that act of terrorism, but then of course the never-ending wars we've had all over the place in that part of the world, right? The dissatisfaction from these forever wars, much more in our face now with climate change, these intractable sorts of problems and issues. These are not so easy to understand or digest. Yeah, and so people are looking for easy answers. Who's the enemy here? That's the enemy? Good, let's go kill him. What can I do about it? Vote for this guy? Got it. He's going to make it okay.
It's so fascinating that you go back into Gen X and the Cold War, because this is where we can pinpoint in conservative Christianity where the rise of left behind, of late great planet Earth, this eschatology of escaping this world for heaven in the clouds was very alluring and also highly, 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 highly successful. I think 80 million copies Tim LaHaye sold. Yet he was also a strong proponent of conspiracy theory and led
Mm-hmm.
people and led also significant policy think tanks around the shaping of the conservative right. As you name these components here, when we see these, and it wasn't sudden, because I think when I look back at folks who have named deconstruction and guests on this podcast from America, almost all of them have named 2016 and Donald Trump as the turning point
Yes.
in their deconstruction. But when I look
Right.
at the rapid escalation of the religious right, and maybe in the sense the resurgence of at least evangelicalism in the United States and that type of right-wing populism that has emerged across the world, but certainly here in North America, that happened, my sense is, around COVID, the pandemic. But you never, and you would have got there, named the pandemic. So in many ways, the pandemic was the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of
Absolutely, it did.
opening the floodgates.
Oh my goodness. Yes. No, and 100% because climate change is one of those slow boiling frog sort of things, right? Where it's like,
Sure. Yeah.
how bad is it really? We had a
Yeah.
bad
Yeah.
winter, we had a good winter,
Yeah. That
whatever,
was
right?
just once. Yeah.
Exactly.
What's 1
So
degree?
yeah, what's 2 degrees Celsius really? I mean,
Yeah.
but
I like the warm weather. There's no snow here.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
oh,
we're
it's
in
great.
California here in Vancouver. So anyway, but all of a sudden you have this worldwide emergency of this disease that we don't know much about, and yeah, and when you're faced with that amount of fear in that short amount of time, all of a sudden people's lives are disrupted, and they have no idea, no way of coping with it. You have all of these, church leaders who don't know what to say about it, because they're not prepared. They're not thinking in
Yeah.
terms of, boy, when this eventual pandemic happens, what will I prepare my people to do, or how are
Yeah.
we going to
Never. Yeah.
do, right?
Yeah.
So, people reach for, again, when they're confronted with terror, they reach for easy answers. They reach for scapegoats.
Yeah.
And in a
Yeah.
very
For
literal
sure.
sense of
Yeah.
can we put our sins on this goat so we can send this away from the community and
Mm-hmm.
absolve our community of sin?
Man, that's another example of how religious formation, and in this case, Christianity, how formation in Christianity actually set the stage to adopt a lot of fringe thinking, because
Hmm.
it's kind of already in the DNA of how to think for
Yeah,
generations of Christians.
right. Yeah. I will point to what I think is a pendulum swing because of Obama. And that sucks to
Because
say.
no, we're blaming Obama. Okay.
We're not, it's all your fault, Obama. Well, and
Thanks,
what I mean by
Obama.
that is that 2 terms of a black man in office
Hmm.
really activated people on an unconscious or subconscious level, especially in the United States. And it's fascinating to me when I lived in the States doing my doctorate. The discussion there is much more around race than it is here in Canada.
Yeah, for sure.
But and the race is black and white. Asians are kind of persona non grata there. An invisible minority, so to speak. But I think, in a lot of ways, a country that was founded in off of the enslaved labor of people,
Hmm.
it cannot ever really fully escape that gravity. And so when you have somebody whose lineage traces back to the people who were
Hmm.
enslaved, there's a usurping of what's unconsciously maybe this feeling that this is wrong.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
because of the general mores of progressivism and this idea of hope that he brings forward, it's that no, we're going to jump beyond like this really kind of weird tickle of hatred or
yeah,
unfamiliarity or fear I have around black people, and
yeah.
we're going to elect a black president. Um, and I think after he was done his 2 terms, there just was a pendulum swing the other way, and this is primarily with white people, um, and um, of course, like you could say a lot about Asian people and their voting records and Latinos for Trump as well and all that stuff, but But again, I think that there's a very deep unconscious swing back towards what Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist, called a colonized mind. That there's this idea of white supremacy that runs very, very strong through all of us, and there's this idea that we're never going to be a fully golden age nation until we get our white man back in power.
Our conversation took a pivot as we interrogated additional inputs that are creating the malformed rationale behind why evangelicals are doing and believe in the things that they do.
I guess the first thing I want to preface all of this is by reminding myself that God is the ultimate materialist. He made everything, and as the creator has said, like, this is all good. However, where we've stepped off course, is when we hold this as the highest good, and the consumption and the throwaway of material goods for just for the sake of what it is we're doing, trying to get the newest and best and feeling good about ourselves, I guess. So I guess thinking through like how we ended up where we are within white evangelicalism and this idea of materialism, what I see in churches, all the churches I've ever visited, is a concentration of wealth and power, and this idea, this conflation of economic prosperity, financial prosperity, and godliness. So,
that hasn't changed in like 2,000 years, man. That's like,
oh.
has been around since
we've
the
always
dawn of
admired
time.
rich people, right? And one beef of mine I have with the churches I've grown up in is, did we always nominate people who were probably the godliest, the most ardent followers of Jesus to become our elders and deacons? No, we always chose the richest people. We chose
Tell me
Dr.
you grew up in an
So-and-so.
Asian church without telling
Yeah,
me.
right. And it's like, well, Uncle so-and-so, like
Yeah.
he owns his own business and he has like a fleet of Mercedes, and so he must be, God's favorite him, right? I mean,
Yeah,
no, not
absolutely. Yeah.
necessarily.
Dang,
Yeah.
this is like
You're taking something back for you.
Frantz Fanon again is rolling in his grave quoting Jesus on last shall be first. Like there is a parable about this that is the core characteristic of this faith. And anyways, I digress.
But but that's not just Asian churches, right? I think in any church, people have typically chosen, there's some sense of behavior indicating, to some degree, character. But we looked at way too much of that, obviously, right? We've seen this and taken that and run with it. We're drifting into territory along the lines of like, why do churches tend to idolize this sort of people? It's because there's this conflation of, well, these people are materially prosperous. That must mean God has blessed them. But then if God has blessed them, it must be because they lead these really, really good exemplary lives for me. And so, prosperity gospel is really old, but it's also something that, I would say within maybe like the last, 50, 60 years has really taken a hold in America and become part of so much of a layperson's theology. That as long as I keep doing the right things, as long as I keep appearing the right ways, the blessing's going to flow. My bank account's going to be full. I'm always going to have, way too much, for my own good.
It's curious that many of my guests have named capitalism as one of the malformed intersections or pillars. Although it's in society, it is a key component in evangelicalism. Another pillar is individualism. Although there is a story, a myth, called the manifest destiny that many Americans adhere to, and that includes components of bootstrap capitalism, just pull yourself up, try a little bit harder, and you can make it for yourself. It's always about for yourself, never about how can we make life better in our neighborhoods, cities, and beyond. I asked Dr. Ng to share his thoughts on the intersection of rugged individualism and how it plays into our day-to-day, not merely for white evangelicals, because I think this one goes broader. But I will say that one of the key components to evangelical beliefs are rooted in a very individualistic sinner's prayer that you can't find anywhere in the scriptures.
Oh, it's absolutely had a huge impact. So I want to bring in this book-length study by these sociologists. First names forgotten, but Denton and Smith. About 15 years ago, they published this book called Moralistic Therapeutic Deism. And moralistic therapeutic deism is what they observed of all these congregations they visited around America, what they observed of the worship services, what the concerns were, what the teaching was like. And what they said is essentially a middle of the road evangelical church in America is concerned with a moralistic, therapeutic, deistic kind of performance of faith rather than, well, that was the earmark. I don't know what the rather than would be, but the earmark of it, the hallmark of
Yeah.
American style Christianity, which is exported around the world, by the way, is this moralistic therapeutic deism. Now, what is it? Well, this moralism is this idea that as long as you are doing the right things, there's more of an emphasis on that as opposed to allowing Jesus to be your righteousness. So I think I characterize it as as an emphasis on following the rules and doing good instead of being good and allowing ourselves to dwell in Christ. From this moralistic impulse, you get things like purity culture and this idea of true love waits.
Right.
But we're doing the right things. Like, I would never have sex before marriage, except that you've now made it all about one thing and to the exclusion of many other things that may go into like a deep and vibrant faith. Again, there's this whole impulse we have around making it simple for ourselves. Well, what's behind moralism? Why do we like that so much? Well, it's because it's simple. I mean, you gave us there's 10 commandments. You just got to follow those, right?
I wish,
and that's it, right?
But it's also subjective. Ironically, it is subjective, and it's not merely the simplicity of it, but it is the design to control of it.
Yeah. Yes.
And those subjective rules then become things that just don't matter. Purity culture, as of saying a prayer to get to heaven, specifically like that, to the expense of core items that do. Justice, love, mercy, empathy. So we did the moralistic, unpack the other components for us.
Therapeutic is the second one, and deism's the third. And therapeutic, I mean, it's this idea or this feeling that we need to have a good feeling, So the only
we call it praise and worship. There's no lament there.
The praise of experience, right? So the only experience that matters as a Christian is to feel good. And if it's not,
that's Sunday morning. That's Sunday morning right there.
but there is that impulse in a lot of us, like, I don't feel good, and so if I don't feel good, I'm not going to stick around. So I remember when I was a pastor, we used to have people complain that we were like, well, we like your reality, we like your authenticity, but when are we going to stop being so depressed all the time?
What are you talking about? Like how to love your neighbor. This is so depressing.
Right. So, but it is an impulse, I think, that is quite strong in American churches for whatever reason.
Unquestionably.
We could draw it all the way back to the idea of pursuit of happiness, right? So there was this book called Habits of the Heart. It was written in the 19th.
I bet that's on my shelf. It's either that or I threw it out this year. I bet it's on my shelf.
Threw it out? Oh, the book. But they make the point that the original framing of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, is not the pursuit of happiness. It is actually pursuit of property. But they changed it in pursuit of happiness because not everybody wants property as happiness, right? They realized. However, those impulses are still there for one.
Yeah. So
you have, again, that consumeristic, materialistic.
I didn't know that. The heart of it was, in fact, property to begin with.
Yeah.
That's like right out in the heart of capitalism.
Yeah, very much
Dang.
So that's why that book is so important, because it's like, remember. And of course, like people who majored in history, which I didn't, would know this, right? They're like, oh, of course, yeah. But you can see how the intentions of the founding fathers, I guess, were still kind of are still playing out in these like cultural distinctives. So going back to therapeutic, it's this idea that we need to be happy, and if you're not happy all the time, you're not doing it right. And
You need your quiet time, Ed.
So where this bridges into my field is that less so these days, but a lot of really sincere Christians are like, I'm unhappy or I'm anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the very first things I will do with people I'm working with is sometimes I will say, well, of course you're unhappy and anxious. Have you seen how difficult this world is?
Yeah.
I
Are
do
you living?
know what's going
Be
on.
honest. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're like, well, but I want to find that peace surpasses all understanding. I'm like, sure you do.
And
But
have you looked outside?
right, exactly. It's still pretty tough outside. So how are you going to
Mm,
face it? How are you going to bear with it? Not
mm,
burying your head in the sand.
mm,
It's going to be growing the strength to carry it.
mm,
It's going to be aligning yourselves with the Spirit of God to
mm.
do what He's doing, right? That's the therapeutic side, though, the impulse in us to want to be happy, of course. Like we want to
Sure.
go wherever we feel good, and that's just a natural, normal human psychological process, right? If
Yeah.
you're a congregation that's got a preacher who just keeps on harping on like the sad and awful and trying things in life is going to empty out pretty soon because people, generally speaking, don't want to hear that. They want to hear about hope. They want to hear about salvation. They want to hear about things that make them feel good, right?
Yeah. Well, that explains my church. Thanks, Ed.
Your church?
Why
I think
so
most
small,
churches.
Rohadi?
Yeah.
Because 8 people want to sit there and take it.
No, but the final one, deism, is this theological impulse we have of wanting to keep God separate from His creation.
Mm,
So deism is this theological construct of how this idea that God is this divine watchmaker who's wound up, created this intricate universe, right? Intricate creation, and has wound it up like a watch and just let it go. And it's ticking on its own, because that's what a good watch does, right? A well-designed watch will keep on going forever, right? It ignores God's constant physical interventions into our world, most notably, right, the incarnation of Christ. But deism is this idea that like I'm actually more comfortable with a God who's not incarnated. I'm more
yeah.
comfortable
Yeah,
with a
yeah,
God
yeah.
somewhere out there, up there, the man upstairs, kind of thing, instead of a God who is living and active and amongst us, right? Because that's pretty threatening.
Well, hopefully these 2 guests have not left you with more despair than hope. But that's kind of part of it, naming the malformed conditions that are producing the harm in white evangelicalism. Thank you to Jared. Thank you to Ed. Next time on Farewell Evangelicalism, we start to unpack the tools that are used to propagate conspiracy theories and beliefs. That tool, it's called propaganda. Episode 4, coming at you.
Can't understand it just by hearing it told.